March 18th, 1964. A crisp morning in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. 9-year-old Maurice Ann Civarella kisses her mother goodbye, clutches a bag of canned goods for her teacher, and steps out into what would become her final walk to school. By 1 p.m. that same day, her small body would be discovered in a coal refuse pit, bound with her own shoelaces, strangled with her scarf. The innocent girl who dreamed of becoming a nun would become the center of Pennsylvania's longest-running murder investigation. For 57 years, her killer walked free, until a college student with an extraordinary gift changed everything. This is the story of how modern science, relentless determination, and an unlikely hero brought justice to a case that haunted an entire community for over half a century. But more than that, this is a story about how one killer's ancestry became his downfall, and how the very DNA that allowed him to commit murder would ultimately expose him decades after his death. It was just after 8 a.m. when Maurice left her family home on West 4th Street in Hazleton. She was a quiet, shy girl who played the organ at church and had recently confided to her family that she was considering a life as a nun. The canned goods she carried were for a school charity drive at St. Joseph's Parochial School, just a short walk from her house. Her route took her through a neighborhood she knew well, past houses where neighbors would normally wave good morning, but something was different that morning. Something predatory was waiting. Maurice never made it to school that day. Somewhere along that familiar route, between the safety of her home and the sanctuary of her classroom, evil intercepted her path. When she failed to return home by her usual time, panic set in. The Civarella family contacted police, and within hours, a massive search was underway. The tight-knit coal mining community of Hazleton mobilized like never before. The search ended in absolute horror. At approximately 1 p.m., a man giving his 16-year-old nephew a driving lesson near the Hazleton Municipal Airport spotted what looked like a large doll in a nearby strip mining pit. As they moved closer, the devastating reality became clear. It wasn't a doll. It was Maurice. The crime scene was nothing short of nightmarish. The little girl had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her wrists and ankles were bound with her own shoelaces, and her scarf had been stuffed into her mouth. The canned goods she had been carrying to school were scattered nearby, a heartbreaking reminder of the innocent errand that had led to her death. Detective work in 1964 was a completely different world. No DNA analysis, no advanced forensic techniques, no computer databases. Pennsylvania State Police had to rely on witness interviews, fingerprints, and traditional investigative methods. But they threw absolutely everything they had at this case. The investigation consumed the entire department. Over the next several decades, more than 250 officers would work on the Civarella case, creating a file that would eventually grow to over 4,700 pages. They interviewed hundreds of people, followed thousands of leads, and identified numerous suspects. 2 men became primary persons of interest early in the investigation. One committed suicide during the investigation, taking any potential answers with him to the grave. Another man actually confessed to the crime, but when pressed for specific details that only the killer would know, his story completely fell apart. He had fabricated the entire confession. As the months turned to years, and years turned to decades, the case officially went cold. But it was never forgotten. The Pennsylvania State Police, founded in 1905, would later acknowledge that they had been investigating Maurice's murder for over half of their entire existence as an organization. The breakthrough that would eventually solve the case came in 2007, more than 4 decades after Maurice's death. Revolutionary advances in DNA technology finally allowed forensic scientists to extract a usable DNA profile from biological evidence found on the victim's jacket. Police began checking the DNA profile against new entries in the criminal database every single month, hoping for a match that would finally crack the case wide open. But month after month, year after year, there was nothing. 12 long years passed without a single hit. Then, around 2018, a revolutionary development changed everything. The explosive growth of consumer genetic testing had created massive genealogical databases filled with millions of DNA profiles from ordinary people researching their family histories. Police submitted the killer's DNA to these genealogical databases, and for the first time in over 50 years, they got a hit. But it wasn't exactly what they had hoped for. The match was to a distant relative, possibly a sixth cousin of the killer. It was something, but it wasn't nearly enough to identify the perpetrator. This is where the story takes an almost unbelievable turn. In 2020, an 18-year-old college student named Eric Schubert contacted the Pennsylvania State Police out of the blue. He had heard about the case and wanted to volunteer his services in genetic genealogy, completely free of charge. What investigators didn't know was that they were about to witness what Schubert would later describe as the most challenging genealogical investigation of his entire career. The young student was about to embark on a 2-year journey that would test every skill he possessed. Schubert's approach was methodical, exhaustive, and brilliant. Using that distant DNA match as a starting point, he began constructing family trees, working backward through generations to find a common ancestor. It was like solving a massive, multi-generational jigsaw puzzle with thousands of pieces scattered across decades and continents. The work was absolutely painstaking. Schubert built approximately 50 complete family trees, tracking lineages across multiple states and even back to Europe. He spent countless hours poring over historical records, immigration documents, marriage certificates, death records, and census data. Every single day, he provided investigators with new names, new leads, new avenues to explore. The detective work was truly extraordinary. As Corporal Mark Barron, the lead investigator, later explained, Schubert's ability to generate viable suspects seemed almost supernatural. The young genealogist would call with names seemingly out of nowhere, sending investigators down new paths they never would have considered. "The voodoo that Eric Schubert does is amazing," Barron would later say. During this period, investigators also used cutting-edge technology to generate facial reconstructions of what the killer might have looked like. Using the DNA sample, they worked with laboratories that could predict physical characteristics like eye color, hair color, and facial features. These photos showed what the perpetrator might have looked like in his 20s, 40s, and 60s. Lieutenant Devin Brutowski announced the facial reconstructions at a press conference, hoping they would generate new leads. "I believe it is a tremendous break," he told reporters. "Hopefully the facial features are something somebody can recognize." Meanwhile, Schubert continued his relentless genealogical detective work. After 2 years of investigation, he finally made the crucial connection that would crack the case. He traced the DNA match all the way back to an Italian immigrant who had arrived in Hazleton in 1904. This man turned out to be the grandfather of 2 brothers who had lived in the area during the time of Maurice's murder. The brothers were James Paul Fort and his sibling. Both men were already deceased, but investigators managed to track down the surviving widow of one brother. Remarkably, she still had her late husband's hairbrush after all these years. DNA testing of hair samples from the brush quickly ruled him out as the killer. That left James Paul Fort as the prime suspect. If you're as captivated by this incredible detective work as I am, make sure you hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves true crime mysteries. The combination of old-fashioned police work and cutting-edge science in this case is absolutely remarkable. Born in 1941, Fort was 22 years old when Maurice was murdered. He was a local bartender and bar supplies salesman who had lived his entire life in Hazleton, residing just 6 or 7 blocks away from the Civarella family. What makes this even more remarkable is that despite living so close to the victim and the extensive 57-year investigation involving hundreds of officers, his name had never once appeared in the original case files. But as investigators dug deeper into Fort's background, a deeply disturbing pattern began to emerge. In 1974, exactly 10 years after Maurice's murder, Fort had been arrested on serious charges of rape and sexual assault. The victim described what police characterized as an extremely violent encounter. However, Forte managed to plea bargain down to a much lesser charge of aggravated assault and received only 1 year of probation. 4 years later, in 1978, he was arrested again, this time for reckless endangerment and harassment. The pattern of escalating violence and sexual aggression was unmistakable to investigators. Even more chilling, once Fort was publicly identified as Maurice's killer, other women in the community began coming forward with their own terrifying stories. Gina Donahue Connors, who had been about 9 or 10 years old in the mid-1960s, remembered a horrifying encounter with a man who had tried to lure her into his white car just blocks from where Maurice had been abducted. Donahue Connors recalled the incident with vivid detail that had haunted her for over 50 years. She was walking with friends when a man in a white car pulled up. He rolled down the window and he said, "Come on, we'll give you a ride," she remembered. And we said, "No, we want to walk, that's okay." And he wouldn't leave it. The persistence was terrifying. After seeing Fort's photograph following his identification as Maurice's killer, Donahue Connors was absolutely certain it was the same man who had tried to kidnap her decades earlier. Her story suggested that Fort had been actively hunting for victims in the neighborhood, and that Maurice might not have been his only target. Police have stated that they don't believe Maurice was Forte's only victim. The methodical nature of her murder, combined with his later arrests for sexual assault, suggests a pattern of predatory behavior that likely began before 1964 and continued afterward. Online crime communities have developed several theories about Fort's criminal history. Some speculate that his 1974 arrest might have been connected to other unsolved cases from the late 1960s and early 1970s. Others have pointed out that his relatively light sentence for the 1974 assault might have emboldened him to continue attacking women. Some amateur investigators have also noted the significance of Fort's Italian ancestry in solving the case. Because he came from a relatively small immigrant community in Hazleton, his DNA profile was more unique than it might have been in a larger, more diverse population. As one online commentator noted, "Don't commit murder if you're an immigrant with few others around with similar DNA to you." By early 2022, investigators were completely convinced they had identified Maurice's killer, but they needed absolutely definitive proof. James Paul Fort had died in 1980 of natural causes, possibly a heart attack, at the relatively young age of 38. To confirm their suspicions beyond any shadow of doubt, they would need to take an extraordinary step. With approval from the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office, investigators obtained a court order to exhume Fort's body. In January 2022, nearly 42 years after his death, James Paul Fort's remains were carefully removed from his grave so that tissue samples could be extracted for definitive DNA testing. The results were absolutely conclusive and overwhelming. The DNA profile from James Paul Fort was a perfect match to the DNA profile from the semen stain on Maurice Civarella's jacket. The statistical probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Fort was calculated at 1 in 480 septillion. To put that astronomical number in perspective, that's a 4 followed by 80 zeros. On February 10, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference that would finally bring closure to one of the state's most notorious cold cases. Lieutenant Devin Brutowski announced to the world that after 57 years, 11 months, and 23 days, they had definitively identified Maurice Civarella's killer. The press conference was deeply emotional. Current and retired investigators who had worked the case over multiple decades gathered together, representing generations of law enforcement dedication. Alongside them sat Maurice's 4 surviving siblings, now elderly themselves, who had waited nearly 6 decades for this moment. Her sister Carmen Marie Ratka spoke for the family with a mixture of profound grief and quiet relief. "We have so many precious memories of Maurice," she said. "At the same time, our family will always feel the emptiness and sorrow of her absence. We will continue to ask ourselves, what would have been, what could have been?" The case represents several remarkable achievements in criminal justice history. It's believed to be the fourth oldest cold case in the United States to be solved using genetic genealogy, and the oldest such case in Pennsylvania. The investigation spanned multiple generations of police officers and involved cutting-edge forensic techniques that hadn't even been imagined when the crime was originally committed. Eric Schubert, the young genealogist whose painstaking work proved crucial to solving the case, reflected on the profound significance of bringing justice to the Civarella family. "What he did to her is irreversible," Schubert said of Fort. "But I think there's some closure in knowing that he's no longer alive and out there doing this to other girls." The case has continued to capture public attention even after its resolution. In January 2025, the story was featured on the AE television series Cold Case Files in an episode titled Damn His Soul to Hell, introducing Maurice's story to a new generation and highlighting the incredible detective work that finally brought her killer to justice. For the investigators who never gave up hope over nearly 6 decades, the resolution validated their unwavering commitment. Corporal Mark Barron, who served as the lead investigator, became visibly emotional as he addressed the media. "This is a very important day for our department," he said. "Even though it took nearly 58 years for this case to be solved, I think this should instill in families across the country a sense of hope that justice can still be achieved." The technological aspects of the case have fascinated forensic experts and amateur investigators alike. The fact that DNA evidence could be successfully extracted and analyzed from clothing stored for over 40 years represents a triumph of both preservation techniques and advancing laboratory capabilities. Some experts have noted that this case demonstrates how consumer DNA testing has inadvertently created the largest criminal investigation database in human history. Millions of people who submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry never imagined they were helping to solve decades-old murders. If this incredible story of persistence and justice has moved you as deeply as it moved me, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with others who appreciate the power of never giving up on what's right. Cases like Maurice's remind us why we must never stop fighting for justice, no matter how much time has passed. Today, Maurice Ann Civarella would have been 67 years old. We'll never know what she might have accomplished, whether she would have pursued her calling to religious service or what contributions she might have made to the world. But we do know that her death was not in vain if it serves as a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied. The little girl who never made it to school that March morning in 1964 finally received the justice she deserved, thanks to the determination of countless investigators, the power of modern genetic science, and one college student's extraordinary gift for solving puzzles that span generations. Justice for Maurice came 58 years late, but it came nonetheless, giving hope to families everywhere still waiting for answers.